Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going deep into the case of Thomas Eugene Creech. This guy, he's a convicted serial killer on death row in Idaho. You might have heard the name, been in the news quite a bit.
Creech is, well, he's a fascinating case, really. Convicted of 5 murders, but get this, he confessed to 42. And some folks think there might be even more out there. What gets me is the time, the sheer span of time we're talking about. Decades, from the 70s into the 80s, all these alleged crimes.
Right, and then there's that whole thing last year, the botched execution. That just threw gasoline on the fire, didn't it?
Yeah.
Now he's stuck in this weird limbo on death row, waiting for them to set a new date.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions for sure. Was Creech really this prolific serial killer, or were some of those confessions, made up? And what does it do to the justice system when a death row case drags on for, 50 years? Those are just some of the things we're going to be looking at today.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. We've got, let's see, court documents, psychological reports, news articles going way back, even some letters written by Creech himself. So what's our mission here? We got to separate fact from fiction, right? And try to figure out who IS this guy behind these monstrous crimes.
Exactly. We're going to be sifting through all this, looking for patterns, anything that doesn't add up, any clue that might help us understand how he ended up going down this road.
Well, like they say, every journey starts somewhere. So let's start with Creech's early life. Born in Ohio, 1950. But it's interesting how much debate there is about his childhood. Some sources, they paint a really bleak picture, parents constantly fighting, divorce, living with his dad, then seeing him die.
That's a lot for anyone to deal with, let alone a kid. Makes you wonder, what kind of impact did that have on him? Could it have played a role in his later violence? I mean, we can't say for sure, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle.
And then there are some sources that suggest maybe it wasn't as traumatic as he made it out to be. Talk about a challenge, trying to separate truth from fiction. It's almost like he was creating a story, maybe trying to get sympathy or shift the blame.
No, absolutely. That's something you see a lot with individuals who commit these types of crimes. They try to control how people see them, both during the trial and after. So, yeah, got to take his claims with a grain of salt.
So after Ohio, Creech moved around a lot. By the late 60s, he'd done time for robbery. But details about those years, pretty scarce.
That period's important, though. Could hold clues about how he went from robbery to something much worse. Was he already killing then? Were there signs people missed? Investigators have been trying to fill in those gaps for years.
And then there's the story of his wife, her suicide. Seems like this happened sometime in the early 70s. Again, not a lot of clear details.
Creech claimed later that she was attacked really badly before her death. Said she was raped, even thrown out of a window. He blamed her decline, both physical and mental, on that attack. Said that's ultimately what led her to take her own life.
That's a horrible story, and whether it's completely true or just partly made up, it says something about the world he was living in.
Right.
Violent, unstable. But it also makes you wonder, was he genuinely traumatized by all this? Or was he, again, playing with the story to get people on his side?
That question just hangs there, doesn't it? As we go deeper into his story, remember, this is a guy we K-N-O-W can lie and manipulate. Got to keep that in mind when we look at what led up to his first confirmed murders.
Those murders, they happened in Idaho in '74. Really, that's the starting point for the rest of Creech's life. Lands him on death row, sets off all these legal battles he's still fighting today, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah, but before we get to Idaho, I think it's important to point out that all this mystery around his early life, it just adds another layer of complexity, makes it that much harder to truly understand, what makes a guy like this tick, what drives him to do these things.
All right, so Creech's early life, kind of fuzzy, maybe some tall tales in there. But 1974, things get really dark. The murders of Edward Arnold and John Bradford in Idaho, this is where things really go off the rails. We see what Creech is capable of.
Yeah, and what's really striking, these murders weren't just random, Arnold and Bradford, they were house painters, just offered Creech and his girlfriend Carol Spaulding a ride, trying to be nice, and Creech, he repays them by killing them in cold blood.
It's awful to think about driving along, then bam, victims in Creech's twisted game.
Exactly. And the details, they're pretty gruesome. Shoots both men in the head while they're driving, then dumps the bodies way out in the middle of nowhere. Even tries to get rid of the gun, but, well, he messed that up.
Now, you've probably heard about that crazy courtroom confession, right? Like something you'd see in a movie. Everyone's tense, the courtroom's packed, and Creech just calmly says, "Oh yeah, I've killed 42 people. Not just these two, 42, all across the country."
It was a bombshell, for sure. Sent shockwaves through everything. Suddenly, it's not just a double homicide in Idaho, it's a possible nationwide killing spree. Creech was talking about California, Oregon, Utah, all over, painting this really dark picture.
He even said he was involved with Hell's Angels,
Mm-hmm.
the Church of Satan. Claims some of the murders were, satanic rituals and all that.
Uh-huh.
Super sensational, like ripped from a Hollywood script. But then when you start digging, things get kind of murky.
Yeah, authorities could only tie him to 9 murders total, and none of them showed signs of any kind of ritual stuff. Some investigators even said his descriptions of, satanic stuff sounded like he got it from magazines or movies.
So was he just, adding to the story?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to make himself sound scarier, like some kind of boogeyman?
It's possible, right? You got to think about why someone would do that. Make themselves seem more powerful, more dangerous. Or was there some other reason he felt the need to make things up?
It's like a puzzle, trying to sort through the truth and the lies, the reality and the fantasies created.
Yeah, exactly. It's a constant challenge for forensic psychologists, criminologists, everyone dealing with people who do these kinds of horrific things.
Okay, so let's focus on the murders we know he did, the 9 cases, no doubt about it. Even without the satanic angle, it's a scary picture. Victims of all ages, all walks of life, and his methods all over the place.
Right. Like William Dean, for example. Body found in Creech's own church living quarters in Oregon. Their paths crossed in a really bad way.
And then there's Sandra Ramsamug, a store clerk in Salem, Oregon. Killed during a robbery, just a young woman.
Yeah.
Shows how random some of this was.
And Vivian Robinson, can't forget her, murdered in California. This one really solidified that, yeah, Creech is a multi-state killer, moving around, leaving a trail of bodies behind him.
Then there's Paul Schrader, older guy, stabbed to death in Arizona. Interesting thing is, Creech was arrested for this one, but they acquitted him. Shows how hard it is to actually get a conviction, especially with someone like him.
Right. Sometimes even with good evidence, it's tough to make it stick, especially when the guy's good at, playing the system, making people doubt what they see.
Fast forward a bit, and they finally linked Creech to another cold case, Daniel Walker. Unsolved for decades, but DNA technology, that was the breakthrough.
Amazing how, even after all this time, sometimes justice can catch up. But Creech's story, it's far from over. He's still, even in prison, this enigma. And his legal battles, they just keep making headlines.
Which brings us to another big turning point.
Yeah.
The death sentence. And all the legal stuff that's kept him on death row for, over 40 years?
So in '76, Creech gets sentenced to death for the Idaho murders, Arnold and Bradford. But just 2 years later, Idaho changes their death penalty law. His sentence gets commuted to life. This is where things get, legally speaking, pretty interesting.
It's like a legal roller coaster, right? Just when you think it's going one way, boom, sudden change.
Exactly. So Creech is doing his life sentence, probably figured that was it. But then, 1981, he kills again. Another inmate, David Jensen.
Now, Jensen, he was a car thief, and he was disabled, which made him, a real target in prison. Creech used a sock full of batteries, beat him to death. Brutal, senseless. Makes you question what's going on in this guy's head. Can someone like this ever change?
You've got conflicting stories about what happened. Creech said it was self-defense. Jensen attacked him first. But some people think maybe other inmates paid him to do it.
That happens a lot, right? Prisons, they've got their own rules, their own power struggles. Violence happens, even with all the guards, all the supposed control.
Absolutely. And for Creech, this gets him another death sentence. This time, no commutation. He's going to be Idaho's longest-serving death row inmate, over 4 decades, stuck in this legal limbo.
Decades on death row.
Whoa.
Makes you think. What's the point of punishment in a case like this? What does it do to the inmate, to the families? And what about the cost, all that money?
Big questions, ones we as a society have to really grapple with. The death penalty, it's a tough topic, lots of strong opinions. And cases like Creech's, they bring all those issues right to the surface.
And then, just when it seems like things are finally coming to an end, we had the botched execution in '24.
Ugh.
It was almost like unreal, like a bad dream.
Threw everything for a loop, that's for sure. Medical team couldn't find a vein for the injection. After hours, they just gave up. They literally brought Creech to the edge of death, then sent him back to his cell.
Crazy. And really unsettling. Makes you wonder, is the death penalty even, workable? Is it moral? Can we trust the system to carry it out right?
And for Creech, what must that have done to him? To be that close to death, then have it taken away. I can't even imagine what goes through your mind.
Uncharted territory, legally, emotionally, Just one of the many layers we're trying to peel back here as we dive into this case. But there's more to come, folks. More twists and turns to this story. Man, we've covered a lot, haven't we? Creech's early life, all those murderers, and that whole botched execution thing. It really makes you think, what does justice even mean in a case like this?
It does, yeah. That whole execution, it wasn't just a procedure gone wrong. It became this focal point for all these arguments that were already swirling around Creech.
Right, like, does this make us rethink the whole death penalty?
Yeah.
I mean, if a state can't even do it right, should they be doing it at all? And what about the families of the victims?
Absolutely. They've been waiting, some of them for decades, for some kind of resolution, and then this happens. No one saw that coming, and it forces everyone to really look at their own beliefs about capital punishment. What's it for? Does it even work?
And Creech, what about him? What's it like being that close to death and then suddenly you're back in your cell? Years ahead of you, probably? I don't know how you'd even wrap your head around that.
It's something most of us can't even imagine. We know being on death row for that long can really mess with a person, but a botched execution, that's a whole other level of trauma, I'd say.
Okay, so where did things go from there? They can't just, leave him hanging, can they?
Well, they issued a new death warrant right after, set a new date, but then just weeks before, he got a stay of execution. This gives his lawyers a chance to challenge how they do executions in Idaho, which is where that lawsuit from 2020 comes back in.
Oh, yeah. He sued him over all the secrecy around their execution methods. Can you refresh my memory on that one?
Basically, Creech argued that he had a right to know, what drugs they were using, who was on the execution team, the whole 9 yards. His lawyers said it was about making sure the execution was humane, that they wouldn't screw it up again.
So it wasn't about avoiding death. It was about avoiding a certain kind of death. That's a pretty interesting legal angle.
It is. And the court, they dismissed the suit, but with this stay, who knows, maybe his team will try to bring it up again. Adds another wrinkle to an already pretty messed up case.
Man, just when you think things are going to wrap up, something else happens. The wheels of justice, they turn slow, especially with the death penalty.
It's important to remember, though, these aren't just, cases in a file. These are real people's lives. Creech, obviously. But the victims' families, the lawyers on both sides, the prison staff, everyone involved is affected by these delays, by all the uncertainty.
Okay, big picture time. What does the case of Thomas Eugene Creech teach us? What are the big takeaways here, beyond all the crazy details?
For me, it really shows how hard it is to get real justice in a case like this. The crimes, the difficulty of separating fact from fiction in his confessions, the death penalty debate, the impact on everyone. It's a lot to sort out.
And how do you even decide what a fair outcome is after 50 years? Laws change, how we view punishment changes. It's not like it's frozen in time.
Exactly. This isn't just about one man and what he did. It's about, I think, how we as a society are constantly trying to understand justice, punishment, and what evil really is. Creech's case forces us to look at those questions, even though they're not easy.
What gets to you the most about all this? For me, it's the people, the human side of it. These aren't just names on paper. They had lives. They had families. And Creech himself, he did terrible things, but he's still a person shaped by what happened to him.
That's what makes true crime so fascinating, I think, but also so difficult to deal with. We have to remember the victims, their pain, even as we try to figure out what made the killer tick.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some new ways to look at the case, and, keep following it. This story's not over.
No, it's definitely not over. As long as Creech is alive, as long as his lawyers are fighting, there's no real ending. It leaves us with that question hanging in the air, doesn't it? Knowing all we know now, what does a just outcome look like here?
That's a tough one. No easy answers. And it's a question we hope you'll keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind and crimes of Thomas Eugene Creech. Keep researching, keep asking those tough questions, and never forget the victims whose lives were forever changed by this man.